I think this attempt to pit group against group and person against person is really corrosive and divisive.
The debate around all of this it sometimes gets quite toxic and quite controversial. Why are people so divided on something that seems to everyday people a good thing?
Particularly because I think of this perception that this is all going to families where no one works, and that perception is wrong.
Hi guys, we're here today with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, McFadden, and we're here to talk about what the UK government is doing to tackle child poverty and help young people in the UK. We've both spent the afternoon talking to the young people in this school in East London, and they've given us a lot of food for thought. So let's get into it. So thank you so much for joining us. How do you think child poverty impacts, a child for the rest of their life?
If a child grows up in poverty, for example, the poorest children are less likely to get 5 good GCSEs. They're more likely to have mental health problems later in life. They're more likely to have a job that's low paid. There are consequences that they can carry with them for the rest of their lives. Who knows what great things those young people will do in the future, but if they're living in a household where there's constant pressure of money and people don't know if they can pay the bills from one month to the next, then the chances of them fulfilling their potential is that much lower.
And just for those people that might not know about what was the two-child benefit cap and how has it changed now?
It was a decision to limit state support to families just up to the 2-child limit. So if you had 4 children, 5 children, you would get the same as somebody who had 2 children. And since it came in, about 100 children a day have been going into poverty. So the effect of this year on year was getting bigger and bigger. And so we decided to lift that and to pay support for each child. And one other thing I think it's important to say about this is, in the debate about this, which has been quite hot politically, some people said, but you're taking money from working families and giving it to families that don't work. That's not true. About 60% of the families who will benefit from this have got someone in work. There's quite a lot of child poverty in families where someone is working, but just maybe not earning enough. So I think this attempt to pit group against group and person against person is really corrosive and divisive. And I hope that this is seen as an investment in society for the whole future.
And a lot of people will be interested in how much is it going to cost the UK? Because there's always that conversation, and can the country afford it? So what would you say to that?
Things do have to be paid for. And one of the features of being in government is there are lots of good causes out there, and people will come and say, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And one of the reasons politicians are sometimes not the most popular people in the world is they have to say no as well as yes. And that's part of what you have to do. And it's particularly true in government, because you then have to make the decision and find the money. So we weren't able to do this the day after the election because we couldn't identify the money at that point. And so when the Chancellor was able to do this, she was able to identify how it would be paid for. It costs about £3 billion a year. And she was able to identify raising that through cracking down on fraud and error elsewhere in the benefit system, changes to online gambling taxation, and some changes in the Motability scheme, which is another scheme that the government runs. It is important that things can be paid for, because we don't live in a world with unlimited money for governments. It's all got to be raised, and it's got to be spent prudently and wisely. And that's just part of the maturity that is necessary to be in government.
And the debate around all of this it sometimes gets quite toxic and quite controversial, which it doesn't feel like it should be. But just from your opinion, do you think why? Do you know why that is? Why are people so divided on something that seems to everyday people a good thing, but not everyone feels that way?
I think it's not true in other countries where I don't see such a massive debate about support for children.
Yeah.
So this is support for families both in work and out of work. And I think that perception, which I suspect is deliberately created by some, and for others is just a mistake, that's probably been the biggest thing that's contributed to the toxicity of this. And I hope that it is seen as an investment in children as a whole, not just because we want their individual lives to be better, but as I said, because I think it's in our national interest to have young people who can contribute as much as they can to the country, to their community, to their own lives. And by reducing child poverty, we increase the chance of them being able to do that.
And because youth employment has been rising recently, are you worried about this?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm really worried about this because it's too high, and it's been too high for a number of years. Youth employment has never really reached the levels it was back in the financial crash for a long, long time. That's way back 2008, 2009, but there's a particular rise in the years after COVID. In the last 4 or 5 years, youth unemployment has been rising. And we have this term, it's quite an ugly term, I confess. I don't really like the term, but it's the one people use, not in education, employment or training. People call it NEET.
Yeah.
That number went up from about 600 and odd thousand in about 2021 to almost 1 million by the time of the last election 2 years ago. And it's still almost 1 million. That's 1 in 8 people in England. It is far too high. I am worried about it. And it's a huge priority for me running the Department of Work and Pensions to do something about this and to try to help young people into either an apprenticeship or a training scheme or a job or something productive. Because the last thing I want to see is young people not doing anything constructive.
So how does this youth guarantee work?
There's a few elements to it. For young unemployed people, we're going to offer hundreds of thousands of them short training courses, 4 to 6 weeks. If they still can't get a job after that, the state will step in and actually pay the wages for young people who've been out of work for 18 months or more, 6 months, 25 hours a week at national minimum wage rates. And on top of that, we're offering employers a hiring bonus of £3,000 if they'll take on a young person who's been out of work and on benefit for 6 months. And on top of that, we are putting more investment into apprenticeships. So for a small business, they can get a hiring bonus of £2,000 for taking on a young apprentice. So all across the board, we're sending a signal to business and to young people that we want them to get into training and into work, because the last thing we want is people leaving their education and being on benefits.
A child growing up in the UK, what do you want them to experience outside of like the work world? What else do you think they should be able to experience?
Well, if you're growing up in the UK today, I think you're fortunate. This is a fantastic country. And one of the things that makes it fantastic is that sense of creativity and innovation that there is in the UK. We are 1% of the world's population. What music do people listen to around the world? There's a lot more than 1% of it is British. If you think about other things like film and TV, these cultural products that are produced in the UK that are watched all over the world, the Premier League watched all over the world. I think young people growing up in the UK are growing up in a really special, fantastic country, which contributes far more than its population share. In boxing, they'd say punches well above its weight. So we want to help young people, but there's also, there's great reasons to be proud to be growing up in Britain and to just get out there and take advantage of all that creativity and become part of it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good.
What I got from the Secretary of State of Work and Pensions, Pat McFadden, was that he was invested in young people. Child poverty always gets put into like a tiny bracket, and then we just focus on the money side of it and like we just give him money. But I think from what I'm learning about from Pat was that actually there's a There's a whole cycle of it that we need to not work just on one end and then that's it, job done, now we've done it, we're done. No, there needs to be more work throughout the course of a child's life and a young person's life. So I think it's really interesting to see that the government is actually trying to focus not just on the money, but also this journey of a young child into a young person's life. What I guess I want people to know from this interview is that there's a lot more opportunities opening up, or at least being talked about. The conversations are there, they are focusing on youth unemployment. So if you are a young person that you're thinking, are they doing anything? Well, it seems like, speaking to the Secretary of State of Work and Pensions, that it's an active thing that they're working on. I think what frustrates me so much is how people frame the narrative around child poverty and people needing support. At the end of the day, there's a one-track mind on it. People often, 7 out of 10 children that are in poverty have a working parent. There is facts to support that. It's not just people on benefits just want more benefits. Nobody wants a child for extra bit of cash. That's just not the way the system works. Raising a child costs much more than what they've been provided. But at the end of the day, those that have children or those that are going to have children need support, an extra bit of support. And all it's doing is the children that already are here, giving them a little bit more support and lifting them out of poverty. The young people in the world need to be supported and need the help, and that's all it is. I don't know any other place in the world where somebody's going to debate whether we should be feeding children or we should be providing children with a better life apart from this one.